As many of you know, and are listening to my great appreciation, I'm currently producing a 20 episode or so podcast series called A Tale of Today, which is ostensibly marking the 150th anniversary of the Gilded Age, the novel, as well as the Gilded Age, the periodization. And one of the questions which the series will ask, it has not really yet asked this question, is how appropriate is the common homology between the Gilded Age and what Anna Kornblue has named too late capitalism, the epoch in which we have lived since at least 2007. What is the proper relationship of Twain's metaphor, another way of thinking of this, of Gilded to our own time? My answer to that question also animates my talk today, which is still in process, and that is further complicated by the fact that my whole career has to some degree been organized by this question. 7 years ago, Larry and I organized a Quarry Farm Symposium on lit and econ in the new Gilded Age. And I offer this preface as both an aid to thinking about what brings the pieces of my talk today together, and also as an excuse for why those pieces written between 2011 and this morning might not yet fully cohere. He wore a silk hat at a rakish angle and watched the passing crowds in Euclid Avenue with sharp interest, imagines a reporter for the New York World, in the midst of a lengthy expose published on February 2nd, 1908. It's a suspicious moment in an otherwise rigorously documented article, considering the man being described had been dead 2 years before the reporter knew anything about him, save his name, William Avery Rockefeller. In a debate which had been growing more heated for 3 decades, both sides had become willing to resort to pure invention when it suited their polemical purposes. Joseph Pulitzer, publisher of the New York World, spent thousands of dollars pursuing the mystery of Doc Rockefeller. And he was aided by the legendary muckraker, Ida Tarbell, who insisted the public not only has the right to know, it is the duty of the public to know who he is, whence he came, and his origin. Seems like those are all kind of the same thing. I'm going to put this up here. All right. It had been more than 5 years since Tarbell began publishing her famous History of Standard Oil, yet for John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate she considered the most important man in the world, this was likely the most painful twist of the knife. For decades, John D. had been carefully guarding the secret of his father's double life, as the sensational headline describes it. The Rockefeller paterfamilias was a confidence man before the term was even invented. As early as the 1830s, he was masquerading as a deaf-mute traveler, carrying a chalkboard placard around his neck, exploiting the sympathy of pioneers in a ruse eerily similar to the opening of Herman Melville's 1857 novel. His specialty was quack doctoring, usually under the alias of Dr. William Livingstone, but it was his propensity for seduction which most embarrassed his famous son. Doc had at least 2 wives that John D. knew about, and the world lingered long, that is, the New York world, lingered long over accounts of his bigamy and his son's efforts to conceal the existence of his frontier stepfamily. As a child, John D. idolized his itinerant father. He had his father's talent for exploiting weaknesses like sentimentality, greed, and arrogance. His revolutionary business strategies depended upon his ability to understand, like a con artist, the temperaments of his Marx, to a degree which made it possible for him to predict their actions. Standard Oil was comprised primarily of properties which had belonged to other men of considerable means and equivalent ambition, who made the mistake of believing themselves clever enough to confront Rockefeller head-on, only to discover him already at their flanks. Like his father, who seemed to operate on the edge of the law, John Dee, that's a quote from the New York World Profile, John Dee relished the fluidity of American jurisprudence. Economic historian Sean Cashman echoes the accusations of muckrakers like Tarbell when he says many of his tactics were criminal. It was not a matter of playing poker with the cards in his own hand, but first looking at, then stealing his opponents. But though Pulitzer went to great lengths portraying the crookedness of both Rockefellers, he found no evidence either could be convicted of anything, and he looked. From the moment of Standard's incorporation in 1870, Rockefeller's ambition was a domestic monopoly. He was aware that American law favored competition, but considered it merely a predisposition, not a hard and fast rule. He and his team of managers chipped away at the anti-monopoly prejudices of the American judiciary, bending but not breaking them. As Henry Demarest Lloyd, author of the precursor to Tarbell's history, puts it, Standard was created in defiance of law, exists in contempt of law, and in its living the law dies daily, but it nonetheless exists by law. When the young John Dee did not inherit from Doc, what the young John Dee did not inherit from Doc was his considerable personal charm. Rockefeller was a publicist's nightmare. His rigidity, his seeming insincerity, and his disconcerting physical appearance cohered with his reputation, furthered by Pulitzer, Tarbell, Lloyd, and others, for being ruthless, inhumane, and aloof. John Dee was keenly aware of his shortcomings and preferred to avoid public statements whenever possible. And when Standard Oil came under fire from the press, Congress and the courts, which was pretty much constantly from the mid-1870s until the Supreme Court decision which dissolved the trust in 1911, Rockefeller always leaned heavily on his more charismatic spokespersons, including Samuel Dodd, Henry Rogers, and Mark Twain. By the 1890s, Rockefeller was widely regarded as the richest man on earth, and quite possibly the wealthiest private citizen in history. He was ready to distance himself from the day-to-day operations of Standard Oil. His philanthrocapitalist turn is as emulated by contemporary capitalists as his playbook of cutthroat competition, conglomeration, and scaling. For the next 2 decades, however, he would also be continuously distracted by campaigns to dissolve the Standard Oil Trust. Those campaigns somehow aligned muckraking journalists, many of them socialists, with a bipartisan coalition transparently beholden to other corporate interests. At the turn of the century, this uneasy alliance coalesced behind a self-styled populist politician. Mark Twain called Theodore Roosevelt's unlikely presidency the most formidable disaster that has befallen the country since the Civil War, and he claimed the list of unpresidential things hitherto deemed impossible, wholly impossible, measurelessly impossible for a president of the United States to do, is much too long for invoicing. Mr. Roosevelt is the Tom Sawyer of the political world, Twain wrote. In his frenzied imagination, the great republic is a vast Barnum circus, with him for a clown and the whole world for an audience, and he would go to Halifax for half a chance to show off, and he would go to hell for a whole one. Twain believed the antitrust suit Roosevelt's administration brought against Rockefeller's Standard Oil in 1905 was a sham and a pretense, cynically appropriating the appeal of antitrust activism in order to handicap the company most feared by other rich corporations, which had bought Roosevelt's election and furnished vast sums of money to keep the Republican Party in power. In 1908, Twain appeared alongside Rogers and Rockefeller at a luncheon for magazine publishers in New York City. Bad press, long accepted as part of Standard's business, had reached a fever pitch. For some years now, Twain said, that company has been freely and volubly charged with every crime and every villainy known to the commercial oppression and misconduct. And anybody who could think of any vindictive thing to say about that corporation could properly get a hearing in the newspapers and the magazines. And so the American world was brought to believe that the Standard Oil people were conscienceless criminals, one and all. Standard Oil's sin, Twain argued, was exploiting the corrupt political landscape of the Gilded Age so brazenly, it became transparent to the general public what shameless stooges their elected representatives had become. Roosevelt's goal was not a more equitable economy, but merely less visible evidence of its inequity. As Twain put it, the president persisted in attacking the symptoms and letting the disease carefully alone. This proved prophetic. After Standard was broken up, its largest divisions became Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, Conoco, and Sohio, later absorbed into British Petroleum. The supposedly independent oil companies continued to work together as before, sometimes even headquartered in the same office buildings. As Rockefeller retreated into retirement, having doubled his personal wealth in the frenetic trading following the dissolution of Standard Oil, the industry competition Roosevelt created rewarded the public with more than a century of cartel pricing, regulatory capture, mercenary armies, safety scandals, and environmental disasters. As Twain, a fastidious reader of political economy, knew, Roosevelt's assumption that inefficiency and exploitation were incumbent to monopoly was no longer taken for granted by economists. In what would become the first widely used economics textbook, Alfred Marshall, who actually sought Twain out during his famous tour of the United States in 1875, observed that while classical economic theory assumed that under monopoly conditions prices would rise and production would fall, the 19th century economists could find many examples where this had not been the case. In fact, so-called monopolies, including Standard Oil, were often more aggressive in implementing price-cutting and profit-sharing practices that benefited consumers and rank-and-file employees than companies with smaller market shares. Twain took Marshall's argument a step further, claiming that when monopolies grew large enough to be recognized as such, they became increasingly sensitive to public perception. Therefore, the most effective guard against corporate abuse was not state-supervised dismantling, but using public pressure to persuade them it was profitable to align themselves with common good. Several decades later, Joseph Schumpeter would show that many of the largest companies of the early 20th century continued to increase efficiency and lower prices rather than maximize profits because executives viewed violations of public confidence, not market competition, as the greatest threat to sustained growth. By 1973, John Kenneth Galbraith, reputed to be one of the most progressive economists of the 20th century, would argue that the antitrust movement had done more harm than good. The Sherman Antitrust Act was, for its architects, a useful futility, which provided a cul-de-sac in which reform can be safely contained. Markets are rarely made more equitable by antitrust prosecution, but their inequities are often distributed throughout an oligopoly and thus better disguised. I want to say here, I hope this is not the case in the lean econ era, though there is no guarantee it won't be. But at least one way in which lean econ's administration has changed from her predecessors is that she is no longer applying the consumer standard that became the primary way of bringing antitrust cases and evaluating antitrust cases throughout the 20th century. To be clear, Twain had lots of derogatory things to say about monopolies generally and the Rockefellers specifically, but he came to prefer the bigness and therefore the visibility of the trusts, especially after the new dynasty of international labor organization failed to emerge as he predicted it would in the 1880s. What Twain fears is a return to the secret, conspiratorial, and unchecked operation of exploitation and extraction, which he associates most closely with European monarchy and colonization. Better the almighty dollar, he says, than a tub of rancid guts labeled king. What prevails for much of Twain's public life is what he sees as a tripartite balance of capital, state, and media power. As I think is quite obvious in the Gilded Age, Twain does not regard any of these forces as benevolent or incorruptible, nor is he naive enough to imagine they don't collude with one another when it's convenient, which is often. What he worries about is when these interests become identical, and as a consequence, the triumvirate reverts to monarchic or diarchic power structures. This is one reason he prefers Rockefeller to Pulitzer, whose avaricious consolidation of the publishing industry makes him a dangerous hypocrite in Twain's eyes. Pulitzer pursues a program of horizontal integration by syndication and vertical integration by control of paper mills, ink manufacturers, delivery trucks, and printing machinery, which is perfectly modeled on the Rockefeller playbook of forcing competing drillers and refiners to sell by cornering the market on things like tanker cars and lamp manufacturers. When media power is no longer selectively competing or collaborating with, but has been consolidated into government and private capital, that's how we get kleptocracy. Which brings us to the present. As Eleanor Courtemanche has argued, during the Victorian era, or the transatlantic Gilded Age, if you prefer, there were two thriving traditions of imagining the end of capitalism: the utopian socialist tradition and the apocalyptic liberal tradition. Twain participates in both of these, and in the latter case, projects how the US and the rest of the industrial West might revert to feudalism. There's a lot of examples of this. You can probably think of some of them. The Marxian economist Yanis Varoufakis, in his most recent book, marks the end of capitalist realism by describing our present political economy as something which is already other than capitalism. He calls it technofeudalism. Over the past 2 decades, the platform era, what Varoufakis calls the transitional epoch of cloud capitalism, companies like Alibaba, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, and Meta have been simultaneously enclosing a digital commons while making it imperative to the functioning of both government and the culture industries. During this period, they have further blurred the distinction between money and data, while mystifying the material infrastructure upon which their cloud fiefdoms are built: server farms, power grids, chip manufacturers, coltan mines. We are already, in Varoufakis' terms, cloud serfs, who on the one hand are dependent upon cloud fiefdoms for everything from news to currency to identification, and are also mandatorily subjected to surveillance and to perform free labor on the cloud fiefdom's behalf every time we post, code, or otherwise create digital media which circulates on social platforms, in e-commerce, and in the App Store. Even our searches, scrolls, and browses are commodified and exchanged by cloud fiefdoms, often in ways that make it harder for individuals and public institutions to evade or exit the technofeudal apparatus. Perhaps most startling, there is a poorly publicized project afoot to turn cloud real estate into sovereign territory, referred to as the network state movement. J.D. Vance is a big proponent of this. Yeah. By which in this network state movement, corporations are purchasing or appropriating large swaths of land all over the world on which their corporate governance precedes or even replaces the surrounding rule of law. Our predisposition to believe that imagining an end of capitalism is intrinsically utopian, in a Jamesonian sense, or naive, in a Hayekian sense, may contribute to distracting us from the fact, as Varoufakis argues in no uncertain terms, capitalism is already ended, and we may soon begin to miss it.